In the cold twilight of a March evening, an aging cargo steamer cut across the Atlantic swell, her rusted plates groaning as if protesting every mile. No one watching her from a distance would have guessed she carried a secret. Beneath the peeling paint and weather-worn decks lay hidden guns, false bulkheads, and a crew of young Americans who understood that their voyage might not bring them home. They sailed straight into waters where tankers burned within sight of the shore and wreckage washed onto tourist beaches like grim reminders of a war that had suddenly arrived at America's doorstep. The East Coast glowed each night with city lights that should have been dark. German U-boats prowled offshore, hunting merchant ships with ruthless efficiency. And against that backdrop of fear and desperation, the United States launched a quiet experiment, a weapon built not from strength, but from illusion. The ship was USS Atik, a vessel that had no business going to war. Yet she sailed anyway, carrying the weight of a mission born from crisis. What unfolded in the hours ahead would become one of the most tragic and least-known stories of World War II. In the first months of 1942, the Atlantic became a place of dread for every sailor sailing out of an American port. German U-boats had slipped across the ocean and found a coastline illuminated by cities that refused to dim their lights. At night, tankers and freighters were silhouetted perfectly against the glow of boardwalks, hotels, and amusement piers. For U-boat commanders, it was a hunting ground unlike anything they had imagined. They called it the second happy time. For the United States, it was a crisis unfolding in plain view. By March, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. Ships burned within sight of the Carolinas. Oil slicks washed ashore in New Jersey. Navigation buoys guided submarines as reliably as American ship captains. The Navy had destroyers, but most were committed to convoy duty in the North Atlantic. The eastern seaboard remained exposed, and every week the losses mounted. President Roosevelt asked whether Q ships, the deceptive decoys once used by Britain in the previous war, might buy the Navy time. Admiral Ernest King, facing public pressure and limited resources, gave a reluctant but immediate order: build them. The program was buried in secrecy. 5 civilian vessels were pulled into Portsmouth Navy Yard and quietly transformed into warships with no public announcement, no press coverage, and almost no paperwork. USS Atik, once a slow-moving merchant steamer built in 1912, became the centerpiece of this effort. Her appearance was intentionally unimpressive. The rust streaks, the weathered hull, and the peeling paint all remained untouched. What mattered was hidden. 4 4-inch naval guns behind collapsible panels, machine guns disguised as cargo equipment, and depth charge projectors concealed along the rails. To keep her afloat after a torpedo strike, her holds were filled with pulpwood, a crude but hopeful insurance policy against the power of German explosives. Lieutenant Commander Harry Lynnwood Hicks arrived with a crew that reflected the nation itself. Many were young men called to service after Pearl Harbor, their training compressed into a few hurried weeks. They drilled on the hidden guns, learned how to operate the hydraulic panels, and practiced maintaining silence on deck so the illusion of a helpless merchantman would remain intact. Their ship was slow, their armor was non-existent, their margin for error was small. But their mission was clear: sail alone into the hunting grounds and tempt a U-boat to make a mistake. On the 23rd of March 1942, Atik eased away from Portsmouth's piers under a cold sky. From the dock, she looked like an ordinary freighter heading into another wartime risk. Only the men aboard knew she carried a different purpose, one born of urgency and uncertainty. As the shoreline faded behind her, the Atlantic opened ahead, wide, silent, and deadly. The crew settled into their watches, not knowing that before the week was over, they would encounter one of Germany's most skilled submarine commanders. They were sailing into history, but not the kind they hoped for. Far out in the Atlantic, where the horizon blended into a gray line of mist and rolling water, U-123 stalked its prey with the patience of a hunter who had mastered his trade. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardegen, barely 29 years old but already one of Germany's most feared U-boat commanders, had been carving a path of destruction along the American coast. He had slipped into these waters twice, each time sinking ships with an ease that shocked even his own superiors. To him, the East Coast was illuminated carelessness. To the crew of USS Atik, he would become the face of a fate they could not escape. On the evening of March 26, Hardegen's lookout spotted a faint plume of smoke on the horizon. Through binoculars, the silhouette came into view, an old cargo steamer, slow, alone, unescorted. It moved with the weary motion of a vessel designed for a different era, too sluggish to outrun anything, too lightly built to survive a modern torpedo. It was exactly the kind of ship German doctrine urged submarine commanders to attack on the surface. Torpedoes were precious. Deck guns were cheaper. Hardegen shadowed the ship for hours, submerged, patient, measuring the rhythm of her engines and the steadiness of her course. When the moment came, he surfaced at dusk. The sea was calm enough. The target was unaware. At 700 yards, he fired a single G7E torpedo. It struck beneath the bridge in a violent blast that sent fire billowing through Atik's forward hold. For the Germans, the scene made perfect sense. A merchant crew scrambling in confusion, a lifeboat lowering unevenly, men running to abandon the ship. But deception was the heart of the Q-ship mission, and Atik now faced the moment her crew had trained for. Within minutes, Hardegen maneuvered to finish the job with his deck gun. That was when Lieutenant Commander Hicks gave the order. The hydraulic panels fell away. The hidden 4-inch guns swung into position. Machine guns erupted in a storm of tracer fire that hammered into U-123's conning tower. For a brief moment, the balance of the battle flipped. A single well-placed shell could have ended Hardegen's career, his crew, and his submarine. One German sailor fell with a fatal wound. The rest scrambled as Hardegen ordered an emergency dive, black smoke pouring from the diesels as the boat clawed its way under the surface. The Q-ship had revealed its hand, but the killing blow had missed. Below the waves, Hardegen steadied his crew and prepared his counterattack. He circled back, listening for the wounded freighter, now helpless and burning. At 2,129 hours, he fired again. The second torpedo struck the engine room, stopping the ship cold. For hours more, Atik refused to sink, held afloat by her cargo of pulpwood. Then, without warning, a final explosion ripped her apart. The night sky flashed, and when the fire died, only darkness remained. USS Atik had fought with the courage her crew brought aboard. But courage could not alter the mathematics of modern war. The explosion that tore through USS Atik left no doubt that her battle was over. In the hours after the second torpedo struck, the ship clung stubbornly to the surface, her hull supported by the masses of pulpwood packed deep inside her holds. But the fire spreading through her compartments, fed by ruptured fuel lines and shattered bulkheads, turned her into a furnace adrift in the dark. When the final detonation erupted shortly before midnight, it was as if the ship exhaled everything she had left. A flash lit the waves, shards of steel and burning timber rained down, and then the sea closed over what remained. For the 141 men aboard, there was no escape. Some had reached the lifeboats, but the gale that swept through the region immediately afterward delivered a second, merciless blow. Winds over 40 knots tore at the waves. The cold Atlantic swallowed anything left afloat. By dawn, the ocean was clean again, as though the battle had never happened. Search aircraft from the 1st Bomber Command arrived at first light on March 27, tracing a grid across the empty sea. They found nothing. Whitecaps hid the smallest scraps of debris. The oil slick had dispersed overnight. Hours later, the destroyer USS Noah reached the area and searched with disciplined precision. She recovered wooden planks, bits of cork, empty life jackets. None of it offered answers. All of it hinted at tragedy. 3 days later, patrol planes discovered 5 empty lifeboats drifting 80 miles south of the attack site. They were intact, they were silent, and they carried no trace of the men who had launched them. The storm had taken what the torpedoes had not. Back in Portsmouth, the mood darkened as reports arrived. The Navy pieced together what had happened only after comparing radio logs, straggling distress signals, and the sparse wreckage recovered at sea. Nothing was certain except the loss. And because Project LQ was classified, the families received only the coldest of telegrams. Missing in action, lost at sea. No details, no explanation, no story to hold on to in their grief. Inside Navy headquarters, Admiral Ernest King reviewed the outcome of the program he had authorized under pressure. The results were devastating. 5 converted ships, thousands of man-hours, hundreds of sailors committed to a mission that produced no confirmed enemy kills. Atik, the ship meant to demonstrate the value of the Q-ship idea, had been destroyed on her first patrol. The Germans had known about the program. The element of surprise had evaporated before the ships ever sailed. In the secret assessment completed afterward, the verdict was unambiguous. Q-ships were obsolete in the era of long-range submarines, improved torpedoes, and experienced U-boat commanders. Deception alone could not overcome speed, armor, and technology, and the cost of pretending otherwise had been paid in American lives. The wreck of USS Atik was never found. Somewhere beneath the Atlantic, the remains of the ship and her crew rest in silence, a reminder of how war punishes miscalculation without mercy. In Washington, the sinking of USS Atik arrived not as a headline, but as a classified memorandum. The secrecy surrounding Project LQ meant the nation never witnessed the grief, never saw the faces of the men lost, and never asked the questions that might have shaped public understanding. Inside Navy leadership, however, the implications were impossible to ignore. A weapon system built on illusion had collided with an enemy that had long since learned to see through it. The result was not simply a tactical failure, but a strategic warning. The German reaction came swiftly. Radio Berlin announced the destruction of a 3,000-ton Q-ship, confirming what American intelligence had not yet fully grasped. The U-boat fleet already knew about the program. Years of experience fighting British Q-ships in World War I had sharpened their instincts. By early 1942, German commanders were explicitly instructed to avoid surface engagements with lone merchantmen, fire torpedoes at range. Do not give the enemy a chance to reveal hidden guns. Hardegen's initial decision to surface had actually violated standing orders. He survived because luck favored him that night. For the United States, Atik's loss underscored a deeper truth. The Battle of the Atlantic would not be won through clever decoys or improvised traps. It would be won through structure, coordination, and the deliberate application of technology. In the months following Atik's sinking, the Navy accelerated the creation of coastal convoys. Radar stations expanded along the eastern seaboard. New escort vessels rolled out of shipyards at a pace the German Navy could not match. Long-range patrol aircraft began closing the gaps that submarines once exploited with impunity. To the broader world, these shifts signaled a turning point. The early months of 1942 had revealed American vulnerability, but by the end of the summer, the United States had begun to demonstrate something far more consequential: the ability to learn quickly and adapt relentlessly. The failures of Project LQ did not define the Navy's response to the U-boat crisis. They clarified it. USS Atik became a solemn reminder that desperation cannot substitute for strategy, and that even in war, solutions built on illusion eventually collapse under the weight of reality. In the long arc of the Battle of the Atlantic, USS Atik is not remembered for a victory won or a submarine sunk. She is remembered for something quieter and far more human: the cost of choosing hope over readiness, illusion over capability, and urgency over patience. Her mission was born from a moment when America was reeling, when U-boats prowled the coast with impunity, and every lost ship felt like a wound the nation could not afford. Atik sailed because the Navy needed answers. She died because the answers she carried belonged to another war. What remains today is not the ship, not the wreck, not even the full story of that night. What remains is the legacy carved into the names etched on memorial walls from Virginia to New York. 141 men who followed orders, trusted their commanders, and set out on a voyage they knew might end in silence. Their sacrifice is not diminished by the failure of the program that sent them to sea. If anything, it sharpens the lesson that war is unforgiving to ideas that have outlived their era. The tragedy of Atik teaches us that courage alone cannot overcome flawed strategy. It reminds us that leadership carries a responsibility heavier than any cargo hold, and it warns us that in moments of crisis, the temptation to rely on quick solutions can be as dangerous as the enemy itself. The Navy eventually learned that lesson. Convoys, radar, sonar, escort carriers, and relentless training turned the tide. But those victories came too late for Atik and her crew. Somewhere beneath the Atlantic, the ship rests in darkness, her location unknown, her story once buried in classified files. Yet the men who sailed her deserve more than obscurity. They deserve remembrance, not because their mission succeeded, but because they served with dignity in a moment shaped by uncertainty and fear. If this story resonates with you, share your thoughts. What lessons do you believe the Navy carried forward from the loss of USS Atik? And how should we remember the sacrifices made in the shadow of strategies that failed? Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping their memory alive.